welcome to the new school. And I just want to introduce you briefly, and then we can go into your puzzlement.
We don't need to.
No, but I'd like to go into your puzzlement. But I wanted to do that just as a way of framing this. So Pat Berry, welcome to the new school. Patricia Berry has been active in the Jungian world for nearly half a century, serving on faculties and boards of training institutions as president of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, as well as the New England Society of Jungian Analysts. She teaches and lectures internationally and lives and practices in West Bath, Maine. She was a colleague, a partner, and married to the great archetypal psychologist and co-founder of Archetypal Psychology, James Hillman. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just start, since I was on a roll before we began this.
Could I?
Responses or puzzlement at what I was saying. What's your honest response?
Well, before we do that, could I say the networks of learning?
Yeah.
That really struck me that you began with, because I thought, my gosh, yes, that's what works for me. That's what worked with the beginning of archetypal psychology. Mm-hmm. That's why I want to move here, by the way. Mm-hmm. That's why I was attracted here. Mm-hmm. This is a network of similar minds, or minds that one can learn from. Mm-hmm. It's blown me away since I've been here.
Wonderful.
So I'm ready to sell my house in Maine and live in a trailer here or something. Maybe a tent. But right now I'm at John's, and it's a very nice place.
We'll keep our eyes open for homes for you.
Okay, thank you. So don't undervalue what you have here. This is just absolutely wonderful.
Good.
Thank you. The puzzlement. Well, you put it all together so structurally, and in my mind, so much about Jung and Jungian history is a confusion. Jung spoke first of the dominance of the collective unconscious, and then he defined archetype one way, and then another way, and then another way, and another way, all of which had different implications. He was at a loss too. I mean, he was searching around. I mean, it's like an organ of the psyche, he said, so it has a biological basis. It's like a river run deep by experience, so there's an experiential contribution to it. It's like a crystalline structure in a solution, whatever the heck that means. It meant something very important then, because they were looking at crystals and, in solution. So it meant something scientific and chemical for Jung. He had a lot of different ways, an organ, I said that before. He had a lot of different ways of looking at what archetype was, so that even now, in most of the Jungian world, it's not clear. It's not clear what it is. And there was a point, by the way, in archetypal psychology where we took a sort of shift and changed what we meant by it. This was, fast forward from the beginning to a period in Dallas. We moved to the States, went to the University of Dallas. The deal at that time was each of us teach one course, one semester. And we were given a sort of sinecure just to be within a network of people that were interested in similar ideas. Most of the patients, I was also getting a PhD at the same time there, it came to me because they were frightened of the important man. Mm-hmm. So they found me a little bit more approachable, a little bit less frightening. What I began to notice in my practice was people came in and talked about their archetypes. They dreamt of Demeter on the street. Demeter on the street. Or they would excuse their behavior with things like, well, you see, it's because I'm a child of Dionysus. Mm-hmm. That absolutely, it was an obvious defense. So, I guess what I learned from that was that anything can be used as an defense, even the most brilliant, archetypal psychology. So Jim and I talked about that. So he redefined it then, archetype, this is in an article in Spring, somewhere mid-Dallas period, so say between 80 and 83, as that which claims weight and importance. So he didn't really define it.
Mm-hmm.
It became just a quality instead of a set definition. It was a way of sort of skirting the question in a phenomenal way so that one got the emotional sense of the importance of archetype without the definite structural definition of it.
What was his earliest description of what an archetype was?
Jim's?
Yeah.
I don't think he described what an archetype was. I'm thinking of revisioning.
Mm-hmm.
Did he talk about what an archetype, why archetypal psychology in that book? Did he talk about what an archetype was? I think he just sort of followed Jung's sense of dominance of something universal, cross-cultural, a repetitive motif that was important, that called importance to itself.
So, in our conversation, we'll be going backward and forward, but let's start with a little bit about how you see your views of archetypal psychology practice now. And you have a lovely little essay called Rules of Thumb Toward an Archetypal Psychology Practice, which is in your beautiful collection of essays, Echo's Subtle Body, Contributions to Archetypal Psychology, in second edition. So it begins. The other day I was asked if I still considered myself an archetypal psychologist. The question astonished me. How could I not? I was in at the base level before archetypal psychology was named archetypal psychology. The first as a student adept, later as soror mystica, mystical sister, leaning over the edge with those stirring this heady brew. Newts, lizards, our innards were all in the pot. Not only did I feel archetypal psychology was me, I was part of it. In it for a toe, for two, my whole head, and lots of spit. It's true, in the last several years, I've not hung out much with the folks talking about archetypal psychology. One of the reasons for my absence is that archetypal discussions have become focused increasingly on ideas. I've become increasingly less so.
Yeah.
I certainly honor ideation theory as important. As I age, I become more often hands-on about most things. And then you talk about that, and then you offer a set of rules of thumb. So can you kind of walk us through how you, in your own practice, understand archetypal psychology presently?
It's hard to know which direction to... Certainly, some of the descriptions that Jim gave in Revisioning Psychology are extremely important to me. Seeing through an attitude, an eye, an ear that hears through or hears reverberations beyond the immediate, the first take, the literal take. Seeing through whatever that first thing is to I keep mixing sound and eyes, so just let me mix metaphors to other levels. That quality, I think, is more archetypal psychology, or what would I call archetypal psychology, probably than anything else. I think that's something. You know, I work with students. I've been in the Interregional Society. I've been president twice, once 20 years ago, now again. I was president of Boston. So most of my life has been about teaching students and working with people who are learning to be analysts. So I notice why they come, and I had groups in Maine that would come for a weekend, and we'd work on their cases or their. So we all got very close. But why did they come? The one thing that I felt I could do that they didn't get from other points of view, from other kinds of theories, was this sense of seeing through radically all the time, hearing through radically all the time. Some other psychologists do this as well. Another thing that's important, so part of what archetypal psychology is to me, is a sense of what Jung considered sort of finalism. He calls it finalism, purposefulness, purposiveness. That whatever's presented, even a pathology, has something beyond itself, is pointing beyond itself, more than itself. It's not simply a defense. It's not simply a saying no to life, but it's saying in some hidden way yes to something else, or something else is almost being made at the same time. Now, I wish I had a concrete example. This is, I'm not good at concrete examples. Of how this works, but it stops one from stopping. It gives credit to a psychology, to a psyche, as a living being, this is Groothian-like too, to a living thing that is making something, creating something at the same time. With your death and dying stuff, Michael, I mean, in the dying, there are things being created at the same time. It's not about dying as just a negative thing at all. There's a whole process. There are things being made. And so it is with everything we do. If you look at it carefully, or if you have a friend that can look at it, I have friends who say, oh, well, Pat, don't you see? You know, and so they help me see more than what I'm seeing, you know? I mean, I may see, you know, well, I'm just an idiot, or well, I'm nervous about coming to this thing today, and they say, well, it's important. Of course you're nervous. I say, oh, okay. Instead of saying, you shouldn't be nervous, for heaven's sakes. You know, you've done all sorts of public things. What are you? You know, come on, snap out of it. They don't say that. My real friends say, yeah, of course. Of course you're afraid. That's okay. That's part of living psychological, emotional reality. Who's not? You know? So that's archetypal psychology for me.
But that begs the question.
Of course.
Because we've talked about this a little bit. What do you think you are afraid of today?
What do you mean?
You said that you were afraid of coming here, you know, and you talked to your good friends, and your friends said, of course, it's important. Can you name what that fear is? You've done a lot of public speaking. We've talked a bit about this. But just because it's an important part of this process, what do you think that fear is? Well,
one part of it certainly is that this is very personal. I mean, this is my life.
Right.
That I'm talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's big. Yeah. You know, I don't want to lose it.
Right.
I could easily lose it here. Don't want to do that.
Right.
So that's a fear. I want archetypal psychology to live, so I want to give it credit. I want to do credit to it, by it.
Right.
I want to help a point of view that seems to me an extremely important one that's goes other ways right now.
Right.
I want to say how I see it, how I saw it, what we were doing in the beginning.
Right. And there's an important way in which your deep contribution to this, in my view, has not been recognized.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I am hoping today is to sketch out what your contribution to this has been, your engagement with it. You know, because I think, in my view, it's astonishing how often, quote, great men or great women, but most often great men, have a partner who is not acknowledged in their, you know.
Right.
I mean,
one
thinks again and again of Rilke, for example, you know, and his, you know, love poems to God, right, which were to a woman, you know, who was enormously important in his life, you know. You know, one thinks of Rumi. We all think of Rumi. We forget about Shams, who was the one who broke him open. So it is the way in which, in these partnerships, we are broken open to love, to loss, to everything, that expands us into the real soul contributions, right? And very often those partnerships are erased by history or in one form or another. And it seems to me, if we are going to see networks of learning and the ways in which we learn from each other, it's really useful to undo that erasure, you know? So diving right into that, the Rules of Thumb essay, when was that written, roughly?
See, there was a thing for Jim in Pittsburgh 5 years ago.
Okay.
And so we were invited to write so many words like that. So let's say 5 years.
So the last rule of thumb, the last paragraph in this beautiful essay on Rules of Thumb says, "Thank you, Jim Hillman. Those years in the mix with you were fundamental to my learning, glorious in reach and spread and lift, beyond inspirational. It was an extraordinary ride. I remain deeply and forever grateful to you, my teacher." Right. Yeah. And this was after not only your marriage had ended, but if I have the history right, after what was for you a very painful break when there was a roast of Jim.
Oh, yeah. You're piling it all on at once, Michael. Help.
Yeah, but I just think it's useful.
Couldn't we water it down and sort of...
and you did this incredibly important piece. I think if anybody wants to understand the beginnings of archetypal psychology, you really, in a gentle, loving way, talked about how it actually was. This was 1992.
Yeah.
And after that, if I remember correctly, our conversation, Jim didn't talk to you. Is that
Yeah. Really hurt him.
And so here is, I mean, the way I look at it from where I am, this whole thing is a love story, you know? It's a love story about a relationship. It's more than that, but it's a love story about a relationship with you and Jim, where you were his primary partner through the whole development of archetypal psychology.
20 years.
20 years. Then you broke up. Then you must have maintained some kind of relationship. And then in 92, you do this lovely, you know, contribution to a roast, which wasn't hostile at all, but it was too much for Jim.
Yeah.
Is that basically true?
Yeah.
And then...
Don't keep piling things on.
then after that, you're still saying to him, thank you, you know, for being in the mix together. Do I have that right, basically? Yeah. Okay. So forgive me for piling it on, but let's, you know, just sort of start with the perception that this is a love story.
It is a love story.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a piece of it.
Yeah.
It's not the part I want to focus on.
Yeah.
Let me start with a little piece about that particular talk at Notre Dame. This was a couple years. What was that? 92 was
92.
it? 92. I had left the relationship in 88. I moved to Cambridge. We were still in our vow was to stay in working relationship because our minds worked well together. And, I understood archetypal psychology like nobody, and he understood me like nobody. So when this conference was going to happen, he said, you must give a talk. He says, you must be one of the primary speakers. He thought I had pulled away because I didn't want to give talks anymore. I didn't want to do intellectual things, and I didn't want to do intellectual things. And that's a whole other story that we may get to if you don't stop pushing me forward. All I could do, honestly, authentically, was, or wanted to do, I still couldn't think. I went through a whole period of sort of total anti-intellectualism, just burnout of everything that was happening up here. What I wanted to do was to talk about the human side of archetypal psychology, the people involved, the screw-ups, the messes, the drunken things where we all sat around with a bottle of wine and and people jumped up and said things, and a drunk fell through the window one time, and all these things, that go on. They go on, particularly in the beginnings of things, when they're all incestuous and this person's mixed up with this person, this person, and this person. And if you've been through the beginning of any kind of movement or psychology, that's how they start. That's how Jung's world started. That's how Freud's Wednesday nights started. I mean, they were all dual relationships. They were all human. It's just all this stuff, it comes out of human beings and real human relationships. So what I wanted to do, and I actually thought, and this is where I was off, I thought he would be, a little annoyed and shocked, the way you are when somebody starts peeling layers away, but that by the end of it, he would be on board and he'd be enjoying it. That's actually what I thought, which was a real misperception. And I wish I hadn't done it, but I did. So that's. I wish everybody had a copy of that because it was banned at the conference. After I gave it, one or two people walked out doing. This was a great big conference, maybe 500 people or something in a huge room, and it was really my way of saying goodbye to everyone. That I was no longer part of it, but that to give this roast story tribute, really, to what archetypal psychology had been and what it became. Have you read this one, John? No, so you don't know it either. So they made tapes of all of the lectures, and somebody rushed in and stopped the tapes being made of my lecture. Some people had gotten a copy before the presses were stopped, and so those copies went into a sort of underground copies of tapes and so on. I didn't understand what was so offensive. I don't know how to talk about it from there on because we'd have to talk about specifics, so I'd have to read the whole thing to you, which we might have time to do, Michael. We've got a whole day here.
Well, I think what I'd love to do is to make it available as a resource if that's doable. You can decide whether that is or not. So it's a thought.
Yeah, I have to.
You can think about that.
Yeah, because I want the kids to be.
We're happy to make it as available as you're comfortable making it, because I regard it as a foundational text about the origins of archetypal psychology. And again, if we're going to undo this erasure, which is a small step for
womankind.
For womankind.
Or partner kind, maybe just the partner, whoever the partner is.
Very nice to do that. So let's go. There was a wonderful figure who was sort of another unspoken hero of
Raphael?
Raphael.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell us about Raphael.
Yeah. Rafael Lopez Pedraza, Cuban, who have you heard of him? Do you people know him?
I doubt that anyone has.
That's amazing. Oh, good. Okay.
Oh, really?
He.
Just for the record, Jennifer Stoll has heard of him.
You should have.
Not in depth, but know about it.
The Latin world knows him better because he ended up going to Venezuela, and so he has a. He was the wise old man of archetypal psychology. He was the one. He did a lot of grunting, and he was built like a bull, short little neck. He walked like he owned the walk, and you walked behind him. And he was constantly teaching. He was a kind of, he'd stop and he'd talk at you. I was one of the sort of maenads surrounding him that he talked at. And I hung out with him in those early years because I didn't understand a word he said, but I knew it was unusual, what he was saying. And I knew it was water for the soul, and that my understanding would catch up at some point. But right now I was getting it on an emotional vibe level. It just had to do with thinking in a very, very different way. Okay, he had been a patient of Jim's for 3 years, and then they became friends at the same time, and they met and talked all the time. He had a woman friend, Valerie Donlevy, who was the ex-wife of J.P. Donlevy, the novelist, if you've ever heard of him, the ginger man, and the Irishman. The four of us, once I was together with Jim, went to England, to the Warburg. That's when we first started talking about archetypal psychology. First time, what I remember, the way I remember it, was that we were at a dinner and Raphael got into this thing about polytheism. Polytheism versus monotheism. That's a crazy idea. I'd never heard of anything polytheism, but polytheism was, we knew that was pagan and bad where I grew up in Ohio. And monotheism, of course. Raphael reversed it all. Jim was right with it too. But I would really attribute that to Raphael, that major turn of the ways of living. And the reason that's important, it's not really about, and there's one thing I want to say to you too, Michael, it's not really about gods and goddesses in the end, although it started that way because it started sort of primitively, but about multiple perspectives, many perspectives on anything that are okay. You say it's a polytheism, it means there's gods in those many different perspectives and coming from those many different directions. That's a big thing. It also separated what they were doing from Jung's diagramming part, not from other parts of Jung. What Hillman really did was carry on an aspect of Jung, which I think was Jung's best aspect, and took him away from his diagramming, trying to be a scientist part. Now, I've probably mixed everybody up.
No, that's perfect.
No.
So you said, there over a meal in a fancy English pub, someone, Raphael, I think, made the first move toward what would become archetypal psychology. Raphael was about how the problem in psychology and Western thought in general was monotheism. This notion caught fire, and we went on all afternoon drinking wine, trashing monotheism, and intuiting how things might be different in a more pagan polytheistic world. As with these and many other discussions, the almost daily conversations, kind of went on, fantasizing about this evolving thought. See, Raphael, as I realize as I write this, I get into a lot of comparisons between Raphael and Jim. Raphael always started with the unexpected, like polytheism, then barreled through.
Right.
Jim generally started with the more usual, often scholarship.
Right.
He starts with a scholarly layout. Then he finds a place where he turns on something, turns it upside down, and he's often leaping.
Mm-hmm.
This was all very heady, very exciting for a now 25-year-old, because you came to the Jung Institute at 23.
Yeah.
By 25, you and Jim are partners.
Right.
You say, actually, it's still exciting to a 49-year-old. Let me say something more about Raphael. Raphael had a breadth of cultural and historical knowing that was remarkable, and it seemed to reside not in his head, but in his very being. And so you spoke of yourself as one of the Maenads that surrounded him. And you said other young women came to Zurich and became patients of his, which I never was, thank God. So now there were 4 or 5 of us gathered around Raphael to soak up whatever it was we seemed to be needing and absorbing from him. You know, nowadays psychotherapy would call these complexly personal connections incestuous, or at least dual relationships. But in those days, that's how you did it. Depth psychology began in incest, Freud and his patients and their Wednesday night meetings, Jung and his early followers in relationships, now this. Of course, there were hazards. Not everyone made it through these entanglements unscathed, but it was also rich and full, so totally involving that if you made it through, you were changed forever for good or for ill. There was a lot of sacrifice in this, too. I remember thinking in terms of Giecrich's paper, a certain sacrifice of the virginal state of mind, a sacrifice certainly of innocence, sacrifice of the child. My own tutorial, if you can call it that, with Raphael required my learning how to put aside whatever common sense I had to entertain his less common sense. So, I mean, this is a brilliant, brilliant piece of writing. And so you weren't the only person erased, in a sense. Raphael was also erased.
Yes.
And it seems to me that part of that is that if you go back to this, if Raphael made the first move toward polytheistic thinking, which is at the heart of archetypal psychology, that would be very hard for Jim as the Apollonian sort of founder of something he didn't want to call a field. To acknowledge.
Yeah, and vice versa. I mean, I think there's a lot of this in the history of thought, that Raphael had a kind of brilliance, just starting in a place nobody else started. He was also a self-taught man. I mean, he hadn't gone through how you're supposed to think, as Jim did. Mm-hmm. So he had the brilliant insights. Jim had the ability. Mm-hmm. Jim was a very bright, able, capable, working person who could write, who could work, who could do many things in the world. And so, of course, it fell upon him and with his capacities to put these things together. I mean, Raphael has a couple books out, but they're in Raphael speak. You know, you have to get into an underlayer of things in order to tune into what he's doing. Jim talks to scholars, not scholars, but scholars, maybe our level scholars. I mean, scholars, the field's not scholarly enough, but certain level of people.
I think Ivan Illich called it deinstitutionalized intellectuals.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's right.
You wrote, whereas Raphael circled ideas in a Cancerian backward manner, he was a Cancer, a crab, clasping insights and ingesting them back into himself, into his own being. Jim moved more like a dancer, quick and clear with sudden spins, pirouettes, and somersaults that always seemed to land on somebody's feet. And there was laughter about that. Both men, and I love this, both men were polemicists. They thought oppositionally and generally worked off an other, an enemy that was stereotyped and placed out there. The battering was more Jim's mode because of his martial nature. I think this is, by the way, what is happening with Jim's attack on therapy nowadays. That's the enemy he's battering against in order to create the ideas over here as a result. But Jim is also Apollonic. Apollo-like. So he was able to step back, separate himself from his spars and lunges, then frame the battle, the issues, within an intellectual ideational context and present it. Raphael was Dionysus, not Jim Apollo. This contrast between the two styles, Raphael's mode of being and Jim's brilliance in saying, was fruitful for many years, and so forth. And then ultimately it ended in difference. You see, I think, to me, this text is foundational to understand the origins of archetypal psychology. It is, and I will be very interested if in the second volume of Dick Russell's remarkable first volume biography of James Hillman, I hope Russell, who I've also done a New School conversation with,
Yeah, I heard
has the opportunity to bring this fully into the light. I hope that happens, because I think it's critically important to the history of archetypal psychology. Yeah.
Well, I'm a lot within the first 6 chapters he's in right now in Volume 2. So.
Good.
But these, you know who was there and loved this was Rick Tarnas.
Really?
Yeah, he came
was
up to me
into it.
afterwards. He said, "Anytime you want to come to our house, anytime you're in California, come stay." I mean, he was all for what I had done.
Wonderful. So let's go back to the very beginning. And I know Jim did not like personal biography, or at least he avoided it until he joined this amazing partnership that created this great volume with Dick Russell, who was perhaps the most unusual choice to be his biographer that one could imagine. But they had a relationship. Did you know Dick during those years?
No.
Okay.
Dick came on late.
Yeah.
But I certainly know him now.
What are you willing to tell us about your early life? Where were you born and raised?
I was actually born in Long Beach, California, during the war, on January 16th, 1943. So I'm 72 today.
Whoa. Whoa. We may even be able to, we may be forced to sing you the birthday song.
I do want to hear that.
You want to hear the birthday song? I think there are enough of us who can do it. No.
This dull dirge will not do, but we don't have to sing it. In Bolinas, it's true, we have our own.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Happy birthday, happy birthday, we're in love with you. May happiness be near throughout the coming year, and all the best to you. So keep on smiling every day, and may your troubles fade away, and may you never, ever, ever be blue. So happy birthday, baby. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, thank you, everyone. I'm so glad to be here on my birthday. So, 1943. Yeah, Long Beach.
1943.
My mother was a Navy nurse, and my father was a Marine. They separated before I even knew him. And I also just learned some stuff about my mother, that she wasn't actually a Navy nurse for very long. She went off with him. But anyway, so she was a single mother for the first 4 years of my life. She was a nurse, and so wheeled me around in laundry carts, and they figured out how to raise, this little child for a while. She was exhausted, so she moved, understandably, and I don't think I was an easy child. And went back to Ohio, which is where she had come from. Her father had been an industrialist there and died early, and the kids all just scattered. She went back, had a brother there, and that's where she had gone to high school, so she met there a man who she had known in high school. She married him. They had another family, and so that's mostly where I grew up, in Ohio.
So, somewhere you said that you didn't like to talk about history very much. So, but nonetheless, I will ask you, and you can decide what to say. What was it like for you in growing up? What was your experience of your family? What did you feel? And since this is a kind of the evolution of your journey, and beginnings are important, what was it like?
It was actually. I don't mind talking about history at all. Are we talking personality-wise? Are we talking? I became, of course, very strong early on because my mother needed me to be able to handle, life at that age. When she remarried, I was traumatized. She went away with her new husband back here to the West Coast to show him where she had been, and left me with people I didn't know. So I was just 4 to 5 in there. So it was traumatic.
How long were you left?
I think forever, but I don't know what a couple weeks, I guess, in order to drive in those days to California and then back to Ohio. So I separated myself from him, from the family. They went ahead and had 2 more children, my brother and my sister, 8 years younger, 10 years younger. And I just went out in the neighborhood. I mean, I sort of was my own person in a bad way as well as a good way. I mean, because I was exposed to all sorts of things. It was, and my mother sort of let me. She was a kind of neglectful mother, and they were into their family. They got into sailing. My stepfather built sailboats. My mother made sails. They built 3 houses before that. They were partners who worked together, which is something I actually admired about them very much. And I somehow, I never owned him as my father, and he didn't own me. I was never adopted. So the name Berry that's his name, that I used illegally until I got a passport. And at that time, I couldn't get past the federal government. I got through school, but I couldn't get past the government. My mother went with me to a notary and swore that I was the one that... So I did get a passport. But there's something about that not being who I am that's an important part of who I am. There is a certain remove from identity that actually helps me, or is part of me. Let's just say that. It helps me, it hurts me, but it's part of me.
Who were you in 8th grade?
Waiting for 9th grade.
Okay. But who were you in 8th grade?
I was a good student.
In Ohio?
And kind of normal, got my period. Went to the special dance with a boy, like that.
Yeah. So good student, got your period. What else about, were you outgoing? Were you an introvert? Did you have lots of friends? How did you navigate being in 8th grade?
To answer the question better, I have to go a little bit later than 8th grade, where I was in the in crowd because I was funny.
Okay.
I had, girls get together, and if there's a funny one in the crowd, she's always in the crowd because it's part of this. So I was the funny one. I was smart, and I was head of student council. And
you were an achiever.
I was all those things. Yeah, and I was an achiever, and I made good grades, and I played solo trumpet. I played the trumpet from the time I was 7 until I was 21. So I played with the symphony, I played with bands, I played with orchestras, and it was very weird to have a girl playing a trumpet at that time. And the other side, I had a completely secret life that didn't belong.
Which was what?
What was it at that? Smoking. Secretly hanging out with bad kids as well. There was a period much younger where I broke where I was angry, where I broke windows, and I did all sorts of really bad things that made my mother worry about me, or at least know that I was mad. And I was picked up by the teachers who helped me. Gave me things to read, talked to me, and it really got me through school. I mean, got me to believe in myself in a deeper way that didn't just have to do with grades, but that I was a special person who could go on.
Was there one teacher that was especially important?
There was one in the 9th grade, who I hung out with all the time. She had graduated in journalism and English, and so she was teaching me Shakespeare and writing and things like that. And then she left, and then there was a couple, history teacher and an English teacher, and they would take me home to dinner. They had books. I mean, in my house, we had Reader's Digest, I mean, that was it, and my parents were away on the weekends. They sort of adopted me and lent me books and talked to me.
And who were you as a senior in high school?
President of the Student Council, National Honor Society, got a scholarship to go, I went to Ohio State, but...
So,
yeah.
I mean, it happens in all kinds of different ways, but do you have a sense where that, certainly searching intelligence, but I really want to say brilliance, where that came from? Was that just kind of a biological accident of genetics, or was there some kind of history in the family that you go back to that you feel that came down to you from?
Maybe my father, I didn't know, who was a dropout, a miscreant, in trouble, and that kind of guy.
Okay.
For the little bit of rebel.
Did you ever find him or look for
him? I tried, but no, he was already gone. And an anger. I mean, part of my pathology, part of my, if I look at it with those eyes, normal eyes, I mean, there was a difficulty. As these students knew, there was something going on underneath that was lost. Made me distrust a lot of things that most people trust. I distrusted, I didn't like dishonesty, I didn't like sanctimoniousness, that kind of thing. That quality is something that connected me with Jim later, I think.
Yeah. And what was Ohio State like for you going away to college?
Well, I went there because I thought I would be able to find work and a way to make it, because I didn't have any money at all. It's big. I thought, well, there will be many different ways. That was a wrong choice, I think, because I got lost in the huge classrooms and
Did you have other
TV.
choices?
I didn't. That was the only place I applied.
Okay. Okay.
It was because I was just thinking about money.
Okay. So you applied to Ohio State. What did you study there?
I started off in English.
And so there's a moment at Ohio State when you hear a tape, right? Is that of James Hillman, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about that moment.
I had a friend, a very, very good friend, whose mother worked at the Unitarian Church, and he and I were into Jung. This is really about the end of college, and so he played this tape for me. It was Jim talking about the anima, and it was exciting. I didn't like his sort of Europeanness and his archness. I mean, I was from Ohio. But at the same time, it was interesting. I mean, I wanted to go to Zurich.
I'm in Columbus, Ohio. That's the place Ed Casey comes from, right? It's 1965 when I first hear the voice of James Hillman whirling on a tape. The voice is raspy, up in the head, I think, discordant, strangulated, as though perhaps his collar is too tight. His elocution, certainly a continent away from anything heard in Ohio, is eloquent, elegant. The part of the lecture I remember best is on the anima. This lecture, by the way, became In Search later on. He describes a cool, distant Nordic type that sounds a lot like me, I think, though I'd never thought of myself in anima terms. In general, to my undergraduate abstract way of thinking, this lecture seems simple. You know, it's types of women. But then somebody gives you a book, Suicide in the Soul,
Yeah.
by Hillman. What was that like?
I couldn't read it. Whoa. Suicide.
This isn't English as I've been taught it. All the inverted syntax, the strange elliptical turns, arch and overwrought, I think, schizoid. He seems to say that death is a possibility. You can die if you want for the sake of your soul. Soul. Whatever soul is, he seems to be saying could be more important than life. Betrayal, a pamphlet from the Guild of Pastoral Psychology, was the next thing. This was easier. I could read the English. And since I myself was just coming out of a relationship that crashed, I figured I knew something about the subject. So that brings you to Zurich.
Yeah, but we've skipped a big part before there that's important.
Yeah, what's that?
Which is a drowning, the kid that drowned. I worked at a summer camp and was head of the waterfront. So I was in charge of everything watery and took kids on canoe trips up through upper Michigan and Wisconsin. I had a kid that drowned that I couldn't save, and that knocked me out.
Still does. Yeah.
But it was important. It took me out of school for a year and gave me a chance to just fall apart. And when you fall apart, you eventually come back together. So I tried to work, but I couldn't. Give me a minute. Because it was so dramatic. I tried to work at the waterfront at the university, where I taught life-saving and such things. Thank you. But the water made me dizzy. I worked in a hospital where I had to take care of x-rays. Boy, this is not the part I thought would get me today.
Right.
This is not it at all.
Right.
The part I thought it didn't get me, but it was waiting, waiting to this part, which is the falling apart part. One time I didn't get the film. I didn't get the film to the operating room at the right moment, and so I felt that was my fault.
And somebody died also?
No. Thank God. No. I'm so hypersensitive now.
Yeah.
It's PTSD, we call it now. In those days, we didn't call it PTSD.
Right.
I wish somebody hadn't understood what was going on. I wish I had understood what was going on, because I kept forgetting that I had this reaction. But then I worked just in a department store over Christmas, and I'd hear a siren, and I'd faint. So I was constantly having to stop, sit on a curb with my head down until I could get up and walk again. So that took a while before I could function again. And I can't remember what got me to where I could. I shared an apartment with two other girls, and I sat with my typewriter and just typed everything that came through my head. And that slowly put me back together because I realized I had a head. I had thoughts. I had observations, not brilliant observations, but things tied together. And I didn't know that anything tied together. So there was a kind of knitting back together in this sort of self-imposed therapy of mine. I also then, a little bit later, was in a play, and I could do acting. And that got me out of myself into a character on a stage, and that also, oddly enough, began to give me legs back. And then I remember the sun one day, spring coming through the window, and it's like a shade had lifted from the window. It was like the color. Suddenly I could see colors again. The world took on bright color, and that was the other end of it. And then I went back to school and went boom, 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 A's and everything, and out and off to Zurich.
Thank you for telling us that.
Oh, thank you. And, it's a scar that's just part of life for me now. But.
March 1966, I go to Zurich. I've just turned 23, and I'm about to become the youngest student at the C.G. Jung Institute, which is no distinction, really. At that time, anybody could go to the Institute who wanted to. It's just that no one that young had bothered to apply. As part of the registration, I'm to meet with Director of Studies James Hillman. But I meet a ski instructor instead and go off to Austria. Get caught in a blizzard in the Alps, a blinding one. Somewhat shaken and chastened, I return to the gray and dismal lowlands of Zurich and make another appointment with the Director of Studies. Years later, I learned this prestigious title, Director of Studies of the C.G. Jung Institute, is a title and position actually invented by Jim. It's a good idea and it's later adopted at other institutions. Now, this is Jim the inventor, the initiator. It's also Jim on the career ladder, a ladder he is to flirt with and slide off several times during his career. See, there's a part of Jim that's been drawn to the establishment. He wasn't just an outsider, though he sometimes acts that way. His mother had wanted him to be a diplomat, a statesman. She also wanted him to appear on the Johnny Carson show. So far, he's done neither. He once said he did have a chance to appear on television, but he got sick. So I finally did manage to have an interview with Jim. He was 39 years old. He had hair. He wore tweedy Irish-style suits, which he thought were dapper. I had even more hair. I wore in 60s style to conceal as much of myself as possible. What wasn't concealed, I covered with a dark raincoat down to my ankles. I was hiding. Now, the purpose of the interview was that I was to tell my story, which I did, I thought, was fairly messy. I found Jim to be an unsympathetic listener. I think I had imagined that since I was entering the realm of depth psychology and about to begin a depth analysis, I should start by showing the damaged goods. So I opened up and bared what I thought was my soul with earnestness. Jim was polite but obviously unimpressed. Then, for probably the first and last time and only time in his life, he turned to practicalities. How did I think I was going to live in Zurich with no money, no possibilities of a job? It's illegal for a foreigner to work in Zurich, no ability to speak the language. He told me I was crazy, and that was the end of the interview.
It's true.
But you persevered.
I persevered.
So tell us how you persevered. How did you manage to overcome that?
I knew that there was no way back. Mm-hmm. There was no way back. I met a Swiss guy on the street, and he suggested I put an ad in the newspaper advertising myself as an au pair girl. So he wrote the ad for me, put it in the newspaper, and pretty soon I was hired by somebody, so I worked as an au pair for all those first years in Zurich.
You said it was I spent the first year eating a kind of mush paste that I made by mixing water and muesli. It was grim, Les Miserables experience. Grimmer yet because the classes at the Institute were so disappointing. And my analysis, for which I paid 10 francs, which was $2 then, just made me sleepy. I'd literally go to sleep before going to analysis and sometimes not even make it. But I had a friend, a short, fat Cuban in his 40s, who was Raphael, who we've met. And so that introduced you to a whole world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so you talk about a very uptight Protestant atmosphere, but with Raphael, you began to dance, right?
Oh yeah, there was. Let me tell you about this. This was a dance, a party at Fiertz. You know, Linda Fiertz. Have you any ever heard of her? Nora wrote about her in Those Women. It's the early women in Zurich that really created Jungian psychology. So Linda Fiertz was one of those, and she had one of these magnificent houses overlooking the lake with medieval drawings and paintings in little sections of the ceiling. Her son, Heinrich Fiertz, now owned the house, and so he was part of the party. So all of us students were there, and somebody put on American music, and we all started doing our American thing, you know. And Raphael started doing this sexy thing back. And I mean, you know, this old fat man I was somehow attracted to in this strange way. I mean, you know, not sexually, but...
Not sexually?
No.
Really? Well, when you said you were one of the Maenads around...
Well,
a certain
there's...
erotic relationship.
There was... Forget it.
As we danced, a man from across the room picked up my movement and gave it back to me with such depth and decisiveness that I was transfixed. Not sexual. That night, not sexual, I met this human Raphael had sired a huge group of children of all sizes and ages. These children were not sexual, as you know, by the way, all of us. So Raphael became a friend and a kind of a teacher and guru and so on. So he was really...
He was archetypal psychology. He fathered archetypal psychology in me, anyway.
Right. And made a huge contribution, which has been erased from history.
Yeah.
So this
and I think
from
that is history. Michael, that's history. That's what all of history is.
Well, but you know, there are some people who erase others and others who acknowledge them.
That's true, too.
There are two different ways of working. You can erase others and you can acknowledge them. And I honestly have to say that my preference is to acknowledge people. I find it more interesting. Because
more
I
generous.
find that we really develop in community, you know, and that to acknowledge that community nourishes everybody. Whereas to erase people is another strategy, but it's not the only one.
It's the old-fashioned one, though.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Really?
Well, I think...
do you think Goethe, do you think he acknowledged people around him?
Goethe definitely acknowledged people. Yeah, he talks all the time about the contributions different people made to his thought. You know, I don't know, he may have erased people too, but he certainly acknowledged people. But I mean, what comes to my mind is the Platonic dialogues, you know. There's an example where
it's true.
The whole pursuit of truth is through dialogues, and the people are preserved forever.
Yes.
So then the second semester, you took a course with Jim Hillman on the feeling function. And you said, although it was obvious at the outset that feelings or anything that one might recognize as feelings were not Jim's strong suit, at least the classes were understandable. So
right.
that was your first class with Jim?
I think so.
So then the next class with Jim was on animal images and dreams, and that one struck you. Tell us about that one.
Well, he's sort of, like, what I say in there is how he acts out the various animals in weird ways.
He acts out a
But,
baboon,
yeah, acts out
scratching his
right.
fanny.
But one thing about Jim is, I mean, I feel myself now coming to his side because you're against him. No. I mean, you recognize that he cuts people out. Although he also recognizes a lot of irrelevant people to show that he recognizes people. By the way, and I imagine Goethe might have done some of that too. But. This idea of animals is a strong. It's important in archetypal psychology. There's a sense of and a belief in, this is Jim, instinct as part of the psyche, animals as part of the psyche, animal instinct as part of psychic instinct. An important driving thing, and in therapy and analysis, getting in touch with those animal energies, very important.
There's a place somewhere in the Hillman literature where Hillman talks about entering the psyche, or I'm not sure I'm using the right word, but and the soul, the psyche, whatever, but like a jungle where there are all these animals, and that what the purpose of the ego is to enter it as unobtrusively as possible, simply to watch the animals. He also, there's a place where he talks, maybe you talk about, but I think it was somebody else, about how important horseback riding was for him, or horses. And you kept horses together when you lived in...
No, I was the horseback rider, but I would saddle it and I would help him up on the horse.
but his thing was that more important than the horseback riding was the relationship to the horse. Is that true or not?
I don't know, but
Okay.
I mean, I don't know him saying that. But.
Okay. All right. So in any case, animal instinctual life was central to archetypal psychology, is our point.
Yes.
Yeah. So how did your, well, here's another wonderful story that you tell, but I'd like to ask you to tell it. You went into analysis with Jim. What was it like having an analysis with Jim Hillman at that point in Zurich? What was the experience like?
Well, the waiting room, this is in an old building, was a chair up above on the next floor up. So as soon as he finished with the patient below and they went out, he would look up and then you would come down. So you sort of passed each other. I mean, you heard the person leave, you entered. It was always 20 past the hour, 25 past the hour. It was at an odd time. It wasn't like a 50-minute hour and then you always begin on the hour. It was, it was at odd times. I think I say in there something about if he hadn't had breakfast, your session might be in the coffee shop next door. I had a number of sessions in coffee shop. It might be walking along the street. I didn't have so many of those. But some people did. It was, but I bet you Jung did things like that too. I bet you a lot of early Jungians might have done things like that. It was more casual. It was more a platonic conversation. It wasn't set in a particular room, although we also were in a particular room. Anyway, what were you thinking? I think I've screwed up my text there.
Curious about it. Was he sought after as an analyst in the circles that you both moved in, or not particularly?
Not particularly. There were a lot of important people in town. His analysts, Freddie Meyer, C.A. Meyer, Liliana Fry, von Franz, Barbara Hanna. there were a lot of first-generation Jungians who had worked right with Jung, and they were probably the most sought after.
Meyer, what was Meyer's first name?
Freddie, that's what people call him, C.A. Meyer.
Yeah, okay, Freddie Meyer. So he was Jim's analyst. He was also Jim's wife's analyst, right?
Yes.
He proceeded to have an affair with Jim's wife,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This was part of that incestuous set of relationships. Obviously, Jung had the relationship with Tony Wolff, who probably everybody knew about or did not know about.
Yeah, sure.
So here you have the founder, Jung, who actually integrates Tony Wolff, his lover, into his household.
Stands for it.
Excuse me?
He stands for the situation.
Right, he stands for the situation.
Yeah.
So the Jungian analysts are sleeping with their patients, so it's not an unusual thing. Jim has the misfortune to have an affair with an American woman married to a minister who then sets about trying to destroy Jim and ultimately, with tremendous effort, drives Jim out of the Jung Institute, which leads Jim to the freedom in the face of this professional collapse to create archetypal psychology, just to frame the whole story.
Wow.
But what he was doing, which today would be frowned upon, was in fact the rule rather than the exception almost.
Oh, no, I wouldn't go that far. No, it wasn't the rule.
Well, I mean, most of the analysts were women, but what about the male analysts, you know?
Some of them did, some of them
Some
didn't.
didn't,
There
okay.
were a few homosexual affairs among men, but moments. I wouldn't say it was the rule,
Okay.
and it was not okay. But people didn't. There wasn't such things as ethics committees or ethics procedures, or it wasn't formalized like that in those days. It was much more just a sensibility that there are certain things that weren't really good to do, and you didn't. Most people didn't. Should it happen, then it happened.
But Meyer, who had an affair
With Kate,
with Kate, Jim's first wife, he then went on to, in effect, side with the minister in conspiring to get Jim kicked out for precisely what he himself had done with Jim's wife. It's just a rather striking.
It's even worse. It's even worse than that.
Yeah.
Jim's wife was very wealthy, and so she had rented a sailboat. They all went to the Mediterranean, sailed around Greece. The four of them, the two couples, at the same time as the wife was sleeping with. I mean, it's corrupt. It's horrible. It's horrible. And yet he was the one that went after Jim. You're right.
But Jim had, at a certain level, brought into this sleepy institute where Jim was acknowledged to be the brightest and most able person to have graduated from the institute. No?
A lot of people hated him because he was arrogant.
Right.
And he was. I mean, he was inflated and arrogant.
Right. And then he becomes director of studies, and he begins to, which he made up.
Yeah.
He begins to introduce all these new and creative ideas, which there's a lot of unhappiness with among the worshippers of Jung who constitute the faculty.
Yes.
Is that basically right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Meyer thought Suicide in the Soul was a dangerous book because it wasn't absolutely against suicide. And so that would...
And the point you make about how both Raphael and Hillman were polemicists and how they did their best work in opposition to something.
Yeah.
You see, I think that's the place, because you said I'm against Hillman, which I'm actually not, but after 2.5 years of immersion in Hillman, I do, and I've said this to you, I do find myself in some respects more a Jungian than a Hillman person, but it's not so much Jung himself. It's actually interesting because Hillman, in his official account of how archetypal psychology starts, describes the visit to the Warburg Institute, which written this way sounds like he went alone in the right. And his encounter with Marsilio Ficino, who was the great Renaissance Neoplatonist, who Thomas More wrote an extraordinary book about called The Astrological Psychology of Marsilio Ficino, which interestingly More no longer lists on his website among his books. And I think it's actually his best book, or one of his best books. And I'm so curious about why he doesn't acknowledge
Might be out of print.
No, I got a copy, or maybe it is. Maybe I got it used. But in any case, this is the interesting thing, that Hillman looked for a precursor of Freud and Jung, but he didn't go back to Goethe and the sort of original group that Jung drew on. He went back to Ficino, who I think Jung did not draw on. He went back to the Renaissance to found his own archetypal psychology.
Right. The other side of the Alps.
The other side of the Alps. And which made him very popular in Italy over time.
Yes. He was given the key to the city.
Exactly.
Florence, yeah.
And but the point I'm coming to is that Ficino actually gives spirit enormous importance in his astrological psychology. So there's this dialogue between soul and spirit. The problem for me with Hillman is his apparent disregard, his dissing of spirit. And that's the place where I find myself more a Jungian. It is that, and I was just reading a remarkable book by John Tarrant. Do you know Tarrant? He's a very interesting guy out here who's a psychotherapist and a Zen teacher. He actually does programs here at Commonweal, contemplative practice programs here at Commonweal. But he talks about the dialogue between soul and spirit. And he talks about character as the intermediary force, so that we know we don't identify completely either with spirit, which takes us upward into transcendence, or soul, which is the dark, moist part of ourselves that stays close to the body. Hillman explicitly makes archetypal psychology a soul psychology. He speaks from the perspective of a soul. From my point of view, that's a tremendous service to the field, and what he's done is brilliant. But for me, it is that dialogue between spirit and soul, and following Tarrant with character as the intermediary force so that we don't identify completely with either spirit or soul. And Tarrant goes on to say that integrity is the guide point through which we refine character. So that's what I miss in Hillman. I miss that equal dialogue between spirit and soul, the movement between that which is transcendent and that which is embodied, and our character, for better or for worse, as the kind of mediating process with integrity of some kind. It may not be the integrity of contemporary mores, but our own integrity in some ways as the way we refine our character. That, to me, is the map of psyche.
Well, and this might be the moment to do that. See, back where Jim was, what he wanted to do was to show, he wanted to distinguish something from the spirituality of most Jungian psychology. And so he did it against spirit. He said, bracket that out. I mean, I don't know that he said anything terrible about it, but bracket that out. This is what I'm looking at. I'm looking at soul. I'm looking at the valleys. You know, the worth of the world, or the Keats quote, however that goes, is soul.
Call this world a veil of soul.
That's right. That's right. I mean, that was his job then, because that was the context. The job now may be exactly what you're talking about. It makes sense to me.
Well, when John and I were up at doing a talk at Sonoma State University, a very interesting professor up there told me about the Handbook of Jungian Psychology, which I got. And it really, I think, for people interested in, do you know the book?
No, who did it?
Do you know who did it, John? Okay. To me, it is the best overview of Jungian psychology.
Whoa.
But what's really interesting about it, among many other things, is the respect with which Hillman is treated. And it's very interesting that Hillman started as a rebel against Jungian psychology, but he didn't need to kill the fathers. He didn't kill either Freud or Jung. And so although he was a rebel, what I witness happening, see the Handbook of Jungian Psychology, is there were, of course, many schools of, in other words, Hillman was one of two key people, according to Sonu Shamdasani, who made the break with Jung. And he talks about there were two key people.
Fordham is another big one.
Fordham is the other one who introduced developmental factors. And so Hillman and Fordham were two key post-Jungian Jungians, right? And they opened up the possibility of independent thinking in the Jungian tradition. And now it's widespread. Or at least, if you read the Handbook of Jungian Psychology, it's widespread.
I have to see this handbook.
Yeah, because it's extraordinary how diverse Jungian thought has become from the handbook.
Yeah, it is extraordinarily. I tell you what I was caught in when I was is institutionally, because that's so much part of my world. The training institutes of Jungian psychology have all gone, almost all gone radically psychoanalytic. So in a certain way, things have shrunk. I mean, I fight for diversity, as many different. So that you say that is good.
I think there are just so many Jungians outside the training institutes, right?
Good. Maybe that's the
since
truth.
You inhabit the training institute world. You experience.
But I'm almost out.
You're
My presidency is up in October. After that, I am outside the training world, and I'm moving here.
I should say that the introduction to Dick Russell's book, The Life and Ideas of James Hillman, Volume 1, The Making of a Psychologist, this actually is an interesting example of this embrace of Hillman. Sonu Shamdasani, as we both know, is one of the greatest scholars of Jungian thought. He edited and did a brilliant introduction to Jung's Red Book. I actually have on the table here this extraordinary dialogue between Hillman and Sonu Shamdasani, Lament of the Dead, the psychology after Jung's Red Book. So he has lots of choices. He chooses to do the preface to the Russell book, right? And so he embraces this. And so here's Sonu Shamdasani, one of the most respected Jungians, says, Hillman set out to explore the workings of the creative principle within psychology. Could the creativity of this newly inaugurated field have something to do with the master fathers of Freud and Jung themselves, he asked. As Hillman put it, could the finding of the fathering principle begin through an examination of these actual fathers and the creative principle in them? And then here's the paragraph. Half a century later, one may add the figure of Hillman himself to this pantheon. I want to read that again. This is Sonu Shamdasani. Half a century later, one may add the figure of Hillman himself to this pantheon. Strikingly in contrast to Freud's legacy, there have been arguably only two major original figures following in the wake of Jung. Michael Fordham, who sought to redress the lacunae in analytical psychology with his developmental model, and Hillman, who took on Jung's daimonic inheritance, you know? And so I am impressed that by embracing Hillman, it creates all this space for other independent thought.
Yeah, and I would add Gigerich, Wolfgang Gigerich.
Tell us about him, I don't know.
He was an early archetypalist, a brilliant German fellow trained here at Stanford or Berkeley. Has written now maybe 10 volumes. He's a thinker. I studied him the last couple of years and I've been to his conferences. He's a rational thinker, which is why he broke with Hillman. Hillman's too for him. And he says a lot of brilliant things, and he knows Jung backward and forward. So I would say he's another major force. It's too heady for most people.
What is his contribution?
Very careful thinking through everything that Jung did, and placing it in a sort of Hegelian context. Hegel is a very strong part of his thinking. So it's based on thinking. Not everybody's going to like it. They don't like it, but it's a big contribution.
You know, I had dinner last night with a very interesting friend of ours named Connie Holmes, who was part of the Cancer Help Program work. And I was going to her for an astrological reading. She's an astrologer. We were talking about, and she also loves Hillman's work and studied him in some depth. And we were talking about archetypal studies, both in astrology, you mentioned Rick Tarnas, and in archetypal psychology. And she said something that really interested me. She said that she thought, and it sort of relates to some of the things that you've said about your interest in just sort of the real human interactions as opposed to the idea archetypes. She said that she was interested in the relational aspects of archetypal psychology, and that she thought that a key body of thought was I wish I had my notes here, but it's where the psychologists who were studying the neuroscience of attachment theory.
That's another big thing.
And I found that and she said it came out of the object relations school in England, and that object relations in turn led to attachment theory, and that attachment theory was now being studied in terms of neuroscience. And she talked about, just to make this concrete, she talked about the different attachment styles and how the concept of good enough mothering. And if there's good enough mothering, then you can have a secure attachment to another human being and negotiate your relationships. Whereas if there's not a good enough mothering or parenting, to be better about it, then you get different neurotic styles of attachment that are either clingy and, so forth, or avoidant or whatever. And it just struck me as we talked that there's an interesting conceptual relationship between your interest in what are the real human relationships and Connie's observation about different attachment styles.
I wouldn't want to be in that camp.
Tell me more.
First of all, a good enough mother goes all the way back to Winnicott.
Right.
So,
which was object relations, right?
I guess.
Yes.
The attachment theory at this point is so simplified. I mean, it comes out of a sort of simple scientific model. So there's 4 types of attachment. We got all sorts of types of attachment in us. I mean, I have good attachment, and I have bad attachment, and I have fleeing attachment, and I have clinging attachment. And I mean, it's back to a simple typology, maybe necessary at the beginning of joining attachment theory and neurobiology. I mean, all of this is going to change enormously in the next couple of years. As neurobiology develops and develops and develops, it's all going to become much more sophisticated. But at this stage, for me, it's like primitive typology.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah. But say a little more about what you imagine the impact of neurobiology will have on archetypal psychology.
Yet to see. But it's a fascinating new world. I mean, I'm trying to think something that they've actually... Some of you may know much more about neurobiology than I
There's this whole
do.
group around the Dalai Lama that's been studying neuroscience.
As well.
And, contemplative stuff.
Uh-huh.
So, and people have certainly done it on the neurobiology of love. There's been a lot of...
And they've done things about mirroring and, connecting, and that empathy. You see somebody do that, and they can see it in the brain here. And I think it's stuff we know already in other ways, but it's going to be more and more interesting. I don't know where it will go.
It's interesting to me because I'm fascinated by neurobiology, and I also see it as a new form of scientific materialism. That, to my mind, in other words, I'm fascinated by it, but what draws me is the archetypes, and I don't want to see the archetypes reduced to a neurobiology. I think you lose too much of the actual experiential,
Well, that's why, going back to Goethe and people like that, that's why that is so important right now.
One of the things we've done, probably, I'm guessing, but a dozen New School conversations on archetypal studies in psychology. And one of the things I'm deeply conscious of, and this is such a great example of how helpful John has been to me, where, I put out my current understanding of something, and John says, yes, and, actually when you began studying this, both Pat's work and Raphael's work were foundational, and Jim acknowledged it, but it doesn't show up in the biography, which is another dimension of both the combination of generosity, but also a choice about how to tell the story in the biography. But I'm so aware that anybody who follows the evolution of the archetypal conversations at the New School, that I've been learning my way through this, and that my earlier versions of this were quite different from, and nor do I believe I've come to the end of the process. And then at a certain point, when you were with Hillman and all the rest at the Jung Institute, you needed to take a break. You went back to Ohio, to Ohio State.
That's right.
And at that point, when you're home, Kent State happens
just up the road.
And people get killed. By
5 people get right. So, and then everything explodes into tear gas, and and the whole university falls apart.
I mean, one of the experiences that Pat and I share is that we're almost exactly the same age, so we've been through this long, strange trip together, and so it's definitely been formative for anybody that went through it, in fundamental ways. Bill Clinton has a wonderful line. He says that that people who think that on the whole the 60s and the 70s were a bad thing are conservative, and those who think they were a good thing are liberal. And so that seems to be the current dialogue about, whether the whole counterculture was, despite its tragedies and the civil rights movement and everything else, was it on the whole a step forward, or, and people have different views of that. And let me just add that Commonweal, my friend and colleague Oren Schlasberg, who's here, is our Chief Strategies Officer. We have a profound interest in the millennial generation, which we see as tremendously creative and hopeful, not just the millennials, but as an example. And I often say that my experience of the millennials is that they're the generation we've been waiting for. Because there is this deep connection.
I don't know.
Between, well, for me.
We need to talk.
We will.
Okay.
But for me, there's this really deep connection between the maker movement, the do-it-yourself movement. We have a young millennial couple living in our little homestead, and they are just so wonderful, and their friends are so wonderful. And love what they're trying to do, and I feel that we were more about the theory, and they're more about the practice. And,
involving nature and
involving nature, involving
for sure.
involving that the millennials do not believe they're ever going to make as much money as older generations did, and they are having to do 2, 3, 4 different jobs to make things work. But there's this. I'll tell you what I like most. I was at a wedding engagement party for the young couple that live with us, and their friends were all there, and they were all partnering up and having babies and all this great stuff. And I looked at them and said, you guys seem so hopeful. And they said, we are hopeful. And I said, well, what about all this stuff, And they said, well, it's always been a struggle, but we're hopeful, It could just be the genetics of being young, but I felt like it was more than that. I thought it was just kind of an embrace of the possibility of what somebody once called muddling toward frugality, and the possibility of a life in which cultural values and non-material things develop more importance, and we learn to live in greater balance. So
that would be wonderful.
Me, they're the people who are trying to do that, and I love it. So Pat, thank you so much for this morning.
Thank you.
And
Thank all of you.
Yeah. Thanks for
Thank you for
listening,
holding
everybody.
it.